So as I'm recording this, it is 2 years to the day since Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine. Now, as I was thinking about this, I also happened to watch Ben Shapiro the other day, and he did a fascinating analysis about how Putin works and why he does what he does. And I think we still don't understand Putin like we ought to understand Putin. Until we do, we're going to have problems. But I'm showing this for a couple reasons. One, to help us understand Putin, and two, because you need to know that there are other conservatives. Ben Shapiro is a Jewish conservative American. There are other conservatives who actually articulate support for Ukraine. I don't just mean rank and file. There are some higher profile, and then there are quite a few within government that are actually supporting Ukraine. Okay, let's listen to what Shapiro has to say. I'll break in and comment periodically.
Vladimir Putin is able to ramp up his production, which can last probably effectively another 2 to 3 years. At the levels that he is currently producing, they're spending like 6% of their GDP on defense, by which we mean offense, in places like Ukraine.
Stop. So the first thing there is Putin is much more into a war footing than anybody in Europe. That's bad, but it's also good. And it's good because if Europe steps up into it and Russia has to step from 6 to 15 or something along those lines to keep up, it's going to be very hard to keep up. You couple that with an ability of Ukraine to keep hitting the oil supply, and if they can ratchet down oil and gas revenue while forcing them to ratchet up war capability, it's going to be a terrible thing for Russia.
That's unsustainable for an economy that's truly unworkable in Russia. They do not have a workable economy. It is 50% probably based on oil profits. They do have trading partners, of course, outside the West, but have they been economically damaged by the war in Ukraine? Absolutely.
Sure.
It's damaged everybody, but it has certainly hit Russia. You can see it in terms of the inflation rate. But the reality is that Russia can produce kind of crappy old machinery and ammo, and it costs a lot less money than defensive machinery.
Couple that with the understanding that they don't value the lives of their people in the same way that we do in the West. They're happy to send people into the slaughter or send people in tanks that don't really defend or guard them as well as they should.
Again, all of this is just predicate to the fact that Vladimir Putin really is feeling his oats right now.
Yes, he is.
And not only did he almost certainly kill Alexei Navalny. I say almost certainly because, you try to be a little careful about these things, but he killed Alexei. Alexei Navalny did not die of natural causes in a prison at the age of 47 after being poisoned by Vladimir Putin just about 4 years ago.
And the whole world knows it. Putin knows it. Biden knows it. All the Russian people know it. Most of America understands that. So we all know it. Now, Biden met yesterday with Navalny's widow and, called Putin crazy, and Putin, how could he say these kind of inflammatory things to use such speech is what Dmitry Peskov was talking about. You just killed your arch political rival. I wouldn't worry about the speech issue. Okay.
Immediately arrested upon his return to Russia, sentenced to a gulag for 30 plus years, and then he randomly dies. That is not the way that works. Mm-hmm. Especially not for Vladimir Putin, who makes a habit of killing his political opponents.
He does.
And in fact, unsurprisingly, the Kremlin has now rejected international calls, according to Axios, for an independent investigation into Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny's death in prison. Navalny's allies and family, of course, say that they suspect high-level Russian authorities were involved in his death, which, of course, is absolutely true, I'm sure. The European Council said Mr. Navalny's unexpected and shocking death is yet another sign of the accelerating and systematic repression in Russia. Kremlin they've refused to release his body because they're afraid that if they release his body, then they're going to discover the poison on him or the bruises on him or the broken bones or whatever it is. The country's prison services said he died suddenly after a walk. They claimed he fell unconscious after feeling sick and could not be resuscitated. Of course, all of this has sort of outsized impact in the West because there was a very famous HBO documentary made about Alexei Navalny that won Best Picture, Best Documentary at the Oscars just a couple of years ago. It is a very, very compelling documentary all about his poisoning and his attempt to track down the people who poisoned him, which he actually does. He actually calls one of his poisoners on the phone and gets them to admit the whole thing on the phone. The very tail end of that documentary, Alexei Navalny actually is asked, what is your message to the Russian people in case you're murdered? And here's what he had to say.
Здесь у меня просто очевидная вещь. Не сдавайтесь.
He says, listen, I've got something very obvious to tell you. You're not allowed to give up. If they decide to kill me, it means that we are incredibly strong.
Раз они решили меня убить. Ну и нужно использовать эту силу. Не сдаваться. Помните о том,
We need to
что мы
utilize this power to not give up.
огромная
To
сила,
remember we're a huge power.
которая находится под гнетом вот этих вот чуваков,
That is being
плохих,
oppressed by these bad
лишь
dudes.
потому что ну, мы не можем
We don't
осознать,
realize how
насколько
strong we actually
действительно
are.
сильны. Все, что нужно для торжества зла,
The only thing necessary for the
это
triumph of evil
бездействие добрых людей.
is for good people to do nothing.
Let's pause there for a moment before Ben speaks again, because this is really important. Putin wouldn't have killed him, and we don't know that for 100%, but it's pretty likely, unless he was really scared of him. Unless he feared him, which he did. And by killing him, he made him a martyr. He made him bigger than he ever would have been in life.
So don't be inactive. Okay, and then he was murdered. So either his murder is a reflection of Putin feeling threatened, or his murder is a reflection of the fact that Putin thinks he can get away with nearly anything at this point. And it seems more like the latter, especially because they're not being shy about anything that they are doing right now. Vladimir Putin, according to the Russian news agency, the Russian government has now filed charges against Oleg Navalny, who is the brother of Alexei Navalny. They said wanted under an article of the criminal code. They did not specify what article Navalny's brother was even wanted under. So they're just arresting.
And Solzhenitsyn talked about that in his books, how the laws were written so that they could be vague enough that they could get you for anything. And that's what's going on. How brazen is this? So if you put pressure on us, Navalny family, in order to give the body back, we're going after his brother as well. Like, how absurd is that? It should make you cringe, but this is what he's doing. Russia has become even more authoritarian than they had been for many years since the fall of the Soviet Union. While Ukraine is headlong becoming less corrupt and moving into the Western orbit, Russia is becoming more re-Sovietizing than what it had before.
Alexei Navalny's relatives, who are in Russia right now in an attempt to presumably quash any blowback from their decision to kill Alexei Navalny. Not just that, on Tuesday, Russia's main security agency said that they had arrested another American citizen. This person's a dual citizen of Russia and the United States on accusations of committing state treason by raising funds for Ukraine. The FSB identified the detainee as a 33-year-old woman who lives in Los Angeles. Apparently, she had raised $51 for a Ukrainian organization that bought weapons and other equipment for Ukraine's military. That's because she had sent $50 to Razom for Ukraine, a New York-based nonprofit organization that sends assistance to the country. And the FSB released via Russian state media a video that showed the woman wearing a white hat that covered her eyes being handcuffed and escorted by masked security service officers. If convicted, she faces 20 years in prison.
Now, if she wasn't an American citizen, she has dual citizenship. If she wasn't an American, would she have been arrested for that? It's questionable, but he's holding political prisoners or political hostages here. That's what's happening in Russia today.
And of course, this makes perfect sense considering that Russia is making just a bounty off of American citizens they kidnap.
That's right.
If they arrest Brittany Griner for being foolish enough to fly to Russia with pot in her bag, and then they throw her in prison, they can get like an actual high-level Russian arms dealer released in return for that. They're still holding the Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich. They have no compunction about just randomly kidnapping American citizens. This is no problem for them. Why? Because they're not afraid of the blowback. Again, a Russian pilot who defected to Ukraine has now been apparently murdered. According to the New York Times, Maxim Kuzminov pulled off a daring escape last summer when he defected to Ukraine and handed his military helicopter over to Ukrainian commandos in exchange for $500,000. Ukraine trumpeted the defection as a major coup. In Vladimir Putin's Russia, he was guilty of treason. Ukrainian intelligence officials warned Kuzminov his life is in danger. They urged him not to leave the country. Instead, he moved with his money to a small resort town on Spain's Mediterranean coast. And now he's been found murdered. He's 28, or was 28. Two Spanish police officials with knowledge of the case said the body of a man found riddled with bullets last week in the coastal town of Villajoyosa belonged to Mr. Kuzminov.
Now, does anybody actually believe in America, in Russia, in Ukraine, that it wasn't the Russians that did that, that this was just gang-related violence or something? Could be, it's possible, but it's highly unlikely. And Putin is just being more and more brazen.
Andrei Cherniak, representative of Ukraine's military intel, said he could confirm the fact of his death. There was no information about the possible assailants or motive. So, very difficult to imagine that this person was not, riddled with bullets in a random town in Spain. Sounds pretty Putin-y to me. And again, considering that this is a thing that Vladimir Putin does send his FSB to do. And again, Putin is exploiting the divisions in the West. That's what America's enemies would do.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's what any country would do. Every country who sees itself as a geopolitical opponent of another country hopes to exploit internal divisions. The difference is that in America, we have a democracy, and so internal divisions are pretty obvious and clear. We have a free press. Same thing is true in Europe. For all the problems we have in America or Europe, they are not remotely the same kind of problems. They're a different in category problem from what's happening over in Russia. President Biden had promised that there would be significant repercussions against Russia if Navalny was killed. Unclear exactly what those repercussions are going to be. Putin is figuring he can withstand anything at this point. He's got his money inside the country. He's got his dashas. He doesn't care. According to Yahoo News, the Biden administration will impose major sanctions on Russia in response to the death of Navalny. John Kirby, White House National Security Communications Advisor, said the new sanctions are designed to hold Russia accountable for what happened to Navalny, as well as all its actions over the course of this vicious and brutal war that has raged in Ukraine for 2 years. Unclear what that's going to be. Apparently, they're going to unveil the sanctions package on Friday. The question, of course, is how has that worked so far? Because, of course, the economic sanctions have not done tremendous damage to Putin or his inner circle.
And economic sanctions alone can't do it. Economic sanctions can help coupled with proper military aid, but you need to make sure the actual military aid gets there. Much of this part of the problem is on Republicans right now who need to get their act together.
The realistic answer here is that there are actually things that Biden could do. This is one of the things that's truly amazing about Biden. He will use executive power to try to cram down a vaccine mandate on 80 million Americans using the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. He will attempt illegally to alleviate student loan debt by simply deciding that you no longer have to pay it, using his executive power. But the one area of American law where the president does have tremendous outsized power is in foreign policy, and Biden barely uses it. He won't do it to shut down the border. He won't do it to actually take measures he could take to punish, for example, the Russians. Instead, he is weak-kneed. And he is weak-kneed because, again, virtually everyone on all sides in the United States is incredibly divided. What this situation highlights is really not the evil of Vladimir Putin. It's the weakness of the West. According to Brett Stevens, writing over at the New York Times, he says there are 4 broad approaches that could theoretically be used by Biden with regard to Putin. According to Bill Browder, who's an investor and political activist, who has a really shocking book that he wrote about his experiences facing down Putin. He was a financier who worked in Russia for years and years and years, and then was targeted because one of his business partners was Sergei Magnitsky, who was killed in prison by the Putin regime. So he has a suggestion. His suggestion is that you could enact legislation to confiscate frozen Russian bank reserves for the defense and reconstruction of Ukraine, theoretically. Now, everybody's been very unwilling to do that because they're afraid that there would be a flight from dollar assets if that sort of thing happened, which you understand, right? If you are a foreign actor and you're afraid that the United States is going to confiscate your money if it's held in American dollars, this could harm the American dollar. So that is a risky move.
And that's what I've been saying. Don't do it. I know why you want to do it, but don't do it because it is going to undermine stability in the system. So you can't do it, as much as I understand why you would want to.
With that said, you may have to take those sorts of risks if you hope to actually punish a dictator. Theoretically, you could back dissidents in more significant ways and stop with these hostage trades. If you continue with these hostage trades, Putin he's just going to take more hostages. And finally, you could actually do the thing that Biden really will not do, and that is jack up American production in the oil and natural gas sector. Really ratchet that up. I mean, it's an opportunity, frankly, for America's economy. The fact that Europe is now cut off from Russian oil supplies would be an opportunity for the United States to jack up its LNG production and start shipping all of that stuff over to Europe. Instead,
and if they did that, they would have to worry even less about Russia making money because there would be more flooding the market and it would lower the price of that for everyone. And it would be harder and harder for Russia in that scenario. Okay, so that's it. I wanted you to hear what Ben Shapiro was saying about Putin and Navalny so you could understand the context. But I also wanted you to hear that because I wanted you to hear that there are other conservative voices that are opposed to Russia. Tell me what you thought about that. Put those in the comments below. Thank you for the time. Thank you for the likes, the shares, the subscribes, and the coffees. And thank you for being the kind of person that cares about Ukraine.